I want to tell you about the day my own father stood in a courtroom and called me a liar, not metaphorically, not behind closed doors, in front of a judge, in front of strangers, with the kind of cold certainty that made me wonder if I had somehow invented every memory I had of him being my father. Because when he said those words, those 6 syllables that shattered everything I thought I knew about family, I felt something inside me collapse. And the worst part, he didn't even flinch when he said it, he didn't even look away. He just stood there on that witness stand with his hand still resting on the Bible, the same Bible his own father had taught him to swear on when he was a boy, and he let those words fall out of his mouth like stones dropping into a well, and I listened to them echo all the way down into a place I didn't know existed inside me until that moment. My name is Marcus, and for 34 years I believed that blood was stronger than anything else in this world. I believed it with the kind of desperate conviction that children have, the kind that survives into adulthood even when every piece of evidence tells you otherwise. I believed that the man who taught me to ride a bike, that patient hand on my back, that voice saying, "Steady, steady, you've got it, Marcus, you've got it," was someone who would never deliberately try to destroy me. I believed that because I needed to believe it, because believing the opposite felt like admitting that my entire life had been built on a foundation of lies. And sometimes the truth is exactly that. Sometimes the people who raise you are the ones who wound you deepest. And sometimes you don't discover this until you're standing in a courtroom, watching everything you've built crumble while the person you trusted most watches it happen with absolutely no expression at all. The story doesn't begin in the courtroom. It begins in a warehouse in 1973 when my grandfather was 29 years old and had nothing but a leased machine, a folding table, and a willingness to work until his body gave out. His name was David Chen, and he had emigrated from Taiwan the year before with $200 in his pocket and an English vocabulary of about 40 words. He worked in a textile factory for 6 months, saving every penny, learning every machine, watching how the business actually worked from the inside before he ever tried to build one of his own. And then he borrowed money from 3 different relatives, pooled it together, and signed a lease on a space that was smaller than most people's living rooms. He made his first product, a simple fabric binding used in garment manufacturing, from that tiny warehouse, and he carried the samples door to door himself because he couldn't afford a sales team. Some days he walked 12 miles because he couldn't afford bus fare. Some nights he slept on the floor because he couldn't afford a bed. And he never complained, not once, because he believed that suffering was the price of building something real, and he was willing to pay it. By the time he was 40, he had a company with 40 employees. By 50, he had 3 facilities and a reputation for quality that competitors couldn't match. And by 60, he had built something that was worth more than he ever let himself imagine, because he said money was just a number and numbers could be stolen or lost or taken away. But what he had really built was a legacy, and legacies belong to the future, not to the present. I was 8 years old when he first took me to the main facility. I remember the smell of it, that combination of machine oil and cotton dust and something else, something I now know was the smell of decades of work being done right. He walked me through the floor and introduced me to workers who called him Mr. Chen and seemed genuinely happy to see him, which confused me at the time because I didn't understand yet why a boss would be liked by his employees. He got down on one knee in front of me that day, in the middle of the warehouse floor surrounded by machines and conveyor belts and the hum of production, and he said, "Marcus, one day this will be yours. Not because it belongs to your father, but because I'm going to give it to you. And I need you to understand what that means. It means you're going to have to earn it every single day. It means people are going to test you and try to take it from you and tell you that you don't deserve it. And when that happens, you're going to remember this moment. You're going to remember that I saw something in you that you might not see in yourself yet. And you're going to be strong enough to prove them wrong." I didn't understand any of it at 8 years old, but I remember the way his hand felt on my shoulder, the weight of it, the certainty in his voice. I remember thinking that my grandfather was the strongest person I would ever meet, and that whatever he had built must be worth dying for. I didn't know then that he was preparing me for a war I didn't know was coming. The story begins properly 6 months before that day in court. 6 months that felt like a lifetime and passed like a single heartbeat all at the same time. I had just inherited the family business, or at least I thought I had. My grandfather had built a small manufacturing company from nothing in the 1970s, working 18-hour days, sleeping on a cot in the warehouse during the early years, eating canned soup for months at a time because he couldn't afford anything else. He turned that company into something worth millions. And when he passed, he left it to me, not to my father, not to my uncle, to me, his only grandson. He wrote it out in his will with his own hand, had it notarized 3 times, and told me on his deathbed that he wanted me to have what he had earned, not what someone else would squander. My grandfather knew something I didn't. He knew that my father had been quietly bleeding the company dry for years, taking loans that never got repaid, writing checks to accounts that didn't exist on paper, using company funds for personal expenses while keeping two sets of books that fooled most of the accountants. My grandfather had seen it all, and he had documented it all, and he had made absolutely certain that his will could not be contested by giving me full ownership while my father received nothing but the clothes on his back and a letter that said, and I quote, "You had your chance to be a good son and you failed. Do not contact my grandson." My father did not take this well, and that's putting it in the gentlest possible way. The phone call came 3 days after the funeral. I was still wearing black, still answering messages of condolence from people I barely knew, still trying to process the fact that the man who had essentially raised me was gone forever. My grandfather had been my anchor for as long as I could remember. My father had always been present but distant, like a photograph on a wall that you see every day but never touch. But my grandfather had been hands-on, had spent weekends teaching me about machines and business and how to shake someone's hand firmly while looking them in the eye. My grandfather had told me the truth about things, even hard truths, even truths that made me uncomfortable. And now that man was gone, and I was sitting in my house surrounded by sympathy cards and trying to figure out how to run a company I had only ever watched from the outside, and my father called and his voice was calm and he said, "We need to talk about the will." Not "I'm sorry for your loss," not "how are you holding up," not even a silence that acknowledged the weight of what had just happened, just those 5 words that told me everything about where his priorities actually stood. I told him I wasn't ready to have that conversation yet. He told me he would see me in court, and that's how the next 6 months unfolded. Lawyers' depositions. Documents that seemed to multiply overnight like some kind of legal virus that fed on family bonds and turned them into nothing but paper trails. My father claimed that my grandfather had been mentally incompetent when he wrote the will. He claimed that I had pressured an old man in his final days to change his intentions. He claimed that I was a fraud who had manipulated a dying man for financial gain. He claimed that the signatures were forged, that the notarizations were fake, that everything my grandfather had done to protect his legacy was the product of a confused mind being guided by his greedy grandson. And he produced documents, real ones, notarized ones, with signatures that looked exactly like my grandfather's handwriting because they were his handwriting, because he had written them, because he had wanted me to have this company more than anything in the world. But here's what I didn't know then, what I couldn't have known, what nobody could have prepared me for. My father had money I had never seen before, money that had appeared from somewhere flowing into his legal defense like water through a broken dam. Where it came from I still don't know for certain, I have theories. I think about it sometimes in the quiet hours of the night, lying awake next to my wife while she sleeps, running calculations in my head, the embezzlement. The years of financial manipulation, the accounts my grandfather had discovered in his investigation. My father must have accumulated far more than anyone realized, siphoning funds from the company for 2 decades while smiling and nodding and pretending to be the dutiful son who was just helping out. He had been building his own war chest, one stolen dollar at a time, and he was ready to use it all against me. He had hired one of the most expensive inheritance lawyers in the state, a woman named Patricia Harmon, who was known for winning cases that everyone said were unwinnable. She was smooth and professional and absolutely ruthless, and she knew exactly how to make a case that was completely without merit seem almost reasonable. She was tall, with sharp features and expensive glasses that she adjusted with the tip of her finger whenever she wanted to make a point, and she had a way of looking at the opposing counsel like she was already bored with what they were about to say. She interviewed my father for hours before accepting the case, I later learned. She wanted to make sure he understood what he was asking her to do. He must have convinced her, because she took it on, and she threw herself into it with a ferocity that I would have admired if it hadn't been aimed at destroying me. She subpoenaed medical records from my grandfather's final years. She requested psychiatric evaluations that had been conducted years earlier for entirely different reasons. A routine checkup when my grandfather was 72 that had mentioned mild cognitive decline, something so common in people his age that it barely registered on the doctor's notes. She found a nurse who had worked at the hospice during my grandfather's final weeks and convinced her to testify that my grandfather had seemed confused and suggestible in his last days. That nurse had never met me, had never spoken to me, and was being paid $5,000 for her time in a courtroom, but she sat on that witness stand and looked at me like I was the villain in a story she had already decided to believe. She painted a picture of an old man being manipulated by a grandson who saw dollar signs instead of family. And I was losing. I could feel it happening like watching a slow-motion car crash. You know it's coming, you see the trajectory, you understand the physics of what's about to happen, but you can't move, you can't stop it, you can only watch as the inevitable unfolds in front of you. I would wake up in the middle of the night with my heart pounding, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out how this was happening, why this was happening, what I had done wrong to deserve having my own father try to take everything from me. My wife would put her hand on my chest and tell me it would be okay, but we both knew she was just saying what she thought I needed to hear because it wasn't okay. It was the worst thing I had ever experienced, and I had no idea how to make it stop. The stress was doing things to my body that I hadn't expected. I lost 15 pounds in 3 months. Not the healthy kind of weight loss, not the kind that comes from eating better and exercising more, but the kind that comes from forgetting to eat because your mind is somewhere else, from lying awake until 4 in the morning running scenarios in your head, from the kind of sustained anxiety that makes your stomach feel like it's constantly tied in a knot. My hair started falling out in the shower, more than usual, enough that my wife noticed and gently suggested I see a doctor. I told her I was fine. I wasn't fine. I was falling apart in ways I couldn't articulate to anyone, least of all to myself. I would be in meetings at the company, trying to make decisions about production schedules and vendor contracts and employee schedules, and I would suddenly lose my train of thought mid-sentence, like my brain had hit a wall and couldn't go any further. People would look at me with concern, and I would cover it up with some excuse about lack of sleep, but the truth was that I was drowning and nobody could see it except me. My relationship with my wife, Elena, was suffering in ways I couldn't control. She tried so hard to be supportive, and I was so grateful for her, but the distance between us was growing like a crack in a foundation, slow and steady and impossible to ignore. She wanted me to talk about what was happening, to let her in, to share the weight of it with her, but every time I tried to explain how I was feeling, the words came out wrong. They came out sounding like excuses or deflection, or the kind of male emotional avoidance that she had always hated. I didn't know how to say, "I'm terrified that I'm going to lose the one thing my grandfather gave me, and I'm even more terrified that my own father knows exactly how to make that happen." I didn't know how to say, "I feel like I've been living in a house my whole life and someone just told me the foundation is made of sand, and the whole thing is going to collapse, and I don't know how to stand anywhere anymore." So I stayed quiet, and the quiet grew, and the distance between us grew with it, and I started to feel like I was losing her too, and I couldn't handle that. I literally could not handle one more thing collapsing in my life. So I just kept it all inside and pretended everything was under control even when it absolutely was not. I tried to focus on the company, to throw myself into work the way my grandfather would have wanted me to, but the company was its own kind of war zone. Word had gotten out about the lawsuit, and the employees could feel it. Morale was dropping. Key managers were starting to look over their shoulders, wondering if they should find jobs elsewhere before the whole thing collapsed. Two of our most experienced foremen quit within 3 months, both citing personal reasons, but both leaving in ways that suggested they knew something was about to go very wrong. Vendors were tightening their credit terms, demanding faster payment, treating us like we might not be able to meet our obligations. The accounts receivable were shrinking while the accounts payable kept growing, and I started to understand why my grandfather had been so meticulous about cash flow. He had known how fragile this all was. He had known that it only took one major disruption to bring everything crashing down. And my father was that disruption, deliberately, methodically, with the kind of patience that told me he had been planning this for a very long time. I started to wonder when he had first thought about contesting the will. Had he been planning it while my grandfather was still alive? Had he sat by his father's bedside in the final days and already been calculating how to challenge the document that would deny him what he felt he was owed? The thought of it made my skin crawl. I had always known my father was a difficult man, a cold man, someone who prioritized success over sentiment in ways that sometimes made me uncomfortable. But I had never imagined he was capable of this. I had never imagined that he could look at his own son and decide that winning was more important than the relationship. If you've ever been there, you know exactly what I mean. When someone you love shows you who they really are, and that person is nothing like the one you thought you knew, it's like losing them twice. Once when they change, and once when you realize they were never really who you thought they were in the first place. The day before the final hearing, I barely slept. I sat in my kitchen at 2 in the morning, surrounded by folders full of legal documents that seemed to be written in a language I couldn't read, and I thought about my grandfather. I thought about all the times he had told me that the company was my future, that I was the one who would carry on what he had built, that he needed me to be strong enough to protect it when he was gone. I thought about the night he had called me to his house 6 months before he died, when he had looked at me with those clear, steady eyes that still saw everything even as the rest of his body was failing. And he had said, "Marcus, I need to tell you some things about your father, things you need to know before I'm gone." And I had leaned forward ready to listen, and he had opened his mouth, and then he had closed it again, and he had said, "Not yet, there's time, I'll tell you soon." But he never did. The infection took him 3 weeks later, and those things he wanted to tell me were still locked inside his head, still unspoken, still a mystery I might never solve. I went into that courtroom the next morning knowing that I might lose everything. I wore a suit that my wife had pressed the night before, and I carried folders that contained every piece of evidence I had, every document that proved my grandfather's intentions, every piece of proof that I was not the fraud my father was claiming I was. I walked into that room like I was walking into a war, and the first thing I saw was my father sitting at the opposing table, and he looked at me and he nodded like we were strangers. Not an enemy nod, not a friendly nod, just a neutral, mechanical acknowledgement that I was in the room, like checking a box on a list. That was the moment I understood that the man who raised me was already gone. Something had replaced him, something cold and calculating, and I didn't know who that thing was, but I knew it was not my father. The courtroom itself was not what I expected. I don't know what I was picturing, maybe something from a movie, with dramatic lighting and raised voices and the kind of theatrical tension that plays well on screens. The reality was much more mundane and much more terrible. It was a small room with beige walls and fluorescent lighting that hummed at a frequency just slightly too high to be comfortable. The gallery held maybe 20 people, most of them journalists and court watchers who had shown up because the case had started to attract attention in local media. My grandfather's story, the self-made immigrant who built an empire only to have his own son try to tear it apart after his death. It had a narrative pull that made it irresistible to anyone looking for a story about family and betrayal and the dark side of the American dream. The judge came in and sat down, and she was exactly what you would expect if you had never seen her before. Grey hair pulled back in a professional style, reading glasses perched on her nose, the kind of expression that suggested she had seen every kin. Dear family betrayal a human being could commit and had developed an immunity to all of them. Her name was Judge Catherine Okonkwo, and she looked at both of us like we were nothing more than case numbers on her docket. She reviewed the evidence quickly, asked pointed questions, and allowed both lawyers to make their arguments. My father's lawyer painted me as a manipulator. My lawyer painted my grandfather as a man who knew exactly what he was doing. And through all of it, my father sat there with his hands folded, watching me with absolutely no emotion, like he was watching a stranger and not his own son. I kept looking at him, kept searching his face for some sign, some flick of the man I remembered from my childhood, the man who had thrown a baseball with me in the backyard on summer evenings, who had helped me with my science fair project when I was 12, who had cried at my college graduation when he thought nobody was watching. That man was gone. I couldn't find him anywhere in the face that was staring back at me from across that courtroom. Then my father's lawyer called him to the stand. He walked up there with the same calm demeanor he had carried into the courtroom, and he placed his hand on the Bible, and he swore to tell the truth. And when he began to speak, I felt the room tilt around me like the floor had suddenly become a hill. He talked about my grandfather's declining health in his final years. He talked about how I had been the only one visiting him during his hospitalization, which he framed not as a sign of my devotion, but as evidence of my opportunity to manipulate him. He talked about how I had supposedly convinced an old man to change a will that had been stable for decades. He described a pattern of behavior that made me sound like a con artist in a movie, someone who had spent years engineering a long con to steal a company from his own father. And I sat there listening to it, listening to him describe me as someone I had never been, and I felt something inside me begin to fracture. But then he said it, the words that I can still hear when I close my eyes at night. I believe my son fabricated this entire will. I believe he defrauded my father in his final days of clarity, and I believe he is a fraud. My hands went numb. I remember that specifically the way my fingers lost all sensation like they had been injected with something cold. My chest tightened and I couldn't swallow, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything except sit there and listen to my own father use that word to describe me. Not I think, not it appears, not I'm concerned, just I believe. Like it was a statement of absolute fact, like he knew in his core that I was the kind of person who would do those things, like he had always known and was only now being honest about it. And the thing that destroyed me more than the accusation itself was the casualness of it. He said it like he was ordering lunch. He said it like it didn't matter, like the words were just a tactical move in a game he had already decided to win. and I was just a piece on the board that he was willing to sacrifice. When someone you love tells the world that you are less than what you know yourself to be, something inside you just stops. Not gradually, all at once. Like a switch being flipped by a hand you never expected to reach for it. I looked at my father and I thought, I don't know who you are, and I thought maybe I never did. My lawyer objected immediately. Judge Okonkwo sustained the objection and struck the statement from the record, but it didn't matter. The damage was already done. Everyone in that room had heard it. The jury, because there was a jury, 6 ordinary people who had been selected from a pool of citizens and who were now being asked to decide whether my grandfather's final wishes were real or fabricated, had heard my own father call me a fraud. My father's lawyer had accomplished what she wanted, which was to plant that seed of doubt, to make the jury and the judge think about what it would mean if those words were true. And I sat there watching my father being excused from the stand, watching him walk back to his seat with that same expressionless face, and I thought, this is who he is now. This is who he always was, and I was too blind to see it. The hearing continued for another 2 hours. Evidence was presented, witnesses testified, expert witnesses explained handwriting analysis and notarization procedures and the mental capacity required to change a legal document. My grandfather's personal journals were entered into evidence, and they contained page after page of references to me, to his hopes for the company, to his belief that I was the only one in the family who cared enough to protect what he had built. I had read those journals before, alone in my grandfather's study after he died, reading his handwriting and crying until my eyes were swollen shut. He had written about me with such love and such hope and such absolute faith in who I was and who I would become. He had written on a page dated just 3 months before his death, Marcus is the one who understands. He understands what it costs to build something and he understands what it costs to protect it. My son never understood. My son only knows how to take, but Marcus knows how to give. And that is why everything I have built will survive long after I am gone. But my father's lawyer dismissed them as the ravings of a confused old man. She had an answer for everything, a rebuttal for every piece of evidence, a way of reframing every document and every testimony to fit the narrative she was building. She was good, she was very good, and watching her work made me feel like I was watching a surgeon perform an operation on me without anesthesia, precise and methodical and absolutely merciless. There was a moment about halfway through the afternoon session when I thought I was going to break. Patricia Harmon was cross-examining the handwriting expert my lawyer had called, a professor from the State University who had spent 40 years studying document authentication. She was dismantling his methodology piece by piece, questioning his sample sizes, challenging his statistical conclusions, making his testimony sound like guesswork dressed up in academic language. And I watched the professor's confidence erode, watched him become less certain with every answer, watched him start to hedge and qualify and retreat from positions he had been firm about in his initial testimony. And I thought, this is how it's going to end. This is how I'm going to lose. Not because the evidence isn't there, but because the other side is better at making it seem like it's not there. I looked at Alina. She was sitting in the front row of the gallery, her hands clasped together so tightly that her knuckles were white. She caught my eye and she mouthed the words, "You're okay." And for some reason that broke me more than anything else had. Because I wasn't okay and she knew I wasn't okay, and she was telling me I was okay anyway because that's what you do for people you love when they're falling apart in a courtroom and there's nothing else you can do. You tell them they're okay even when they're not. You give them the words they need to hear even when you both know those words are lies. Judge Okonkwo called a recess, 15 minutes. She said she needed time to review everything before making her decision. And I sat there in that courtroom watching the clock on the wall tick slowly like it was moving through honey, and I thought about walking out. Just standing up and walking out and letting whatever was going to happen because I was so tired of fighting, so tired of watching my own family try to tear me apart piece by piece. But then I looked at Alina and she had her hand over her mouth and there were tears in her eyes, and I remembered why I was fighting. Not for me, for my grandfather, for everything he had given me and everything he had asked me to protect. I owed him that much, I owed him everything. 15 minutes felt like 15 hours. I sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, leaning against the wall, trying to keep my breathing steady. Alina brought me a bottle of water from the vending machine and I drank it even though I didn't feel thirsty because doing something was better than sitting still with my thoughts. She sat next to me and she didn't say anything, and that was exactly what I needed. She understood that sometimes silence is the only comfort you can offer someone. Sometimes you don't need words. You just need someone to sit next to you while the world falls apart. When we went back into the courtroom, something was different. I felt it before I understood it, the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm arrives. Judge Okonkwo came in and walked slowly to her seat, and she was quiet for a long moment before she spoke. And when she finally did speak, something in her voice was different. There was something underneath the professional calm, something that sounded almost like anger, and I didn't understand it at first, but I would understand it soon enough. "The court has reviewed all evidence presented," she said, "and I have some questions for the plaintiff." My father's lawyer stood up immediately. "Your Honor, the plaintiff has already testified and—" "Sit down." The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of a gavel, and Patricia Harmon sat down immediately. Judge Okonkwo removed her reading glasses and set them on the bench, and then she did something that I will never forget as long as I live. She reached up and she unfastened her robe. She lifted it over her shoulders and stood up, and she was wearing regular clothes underneath, professional clothes, a navy blazer and a cream blouse and slacks that looked like they cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. But there was no mistake about what she had just done. She had taken off her robe, which meant she was no longer a judge in that moment. She was something else. She was about to become something else entirely, something that the legal system had no protocol for, something that nobody in that room had anticipated. And then she spoke again, and her voice was shaking, and I realized with a sudden, gut-wrenching clarity that this was not just a judge making a professional decision based on evidence and law. This was something much more personal than that. This was something that had been building for years, maybe decades, something that had been waiting for exactly this moment to finally surface. "My name is Catherine Okonkwo," she said. And for a split second I didn't understand why she was telling us her name, why that was relevant, why a judge would introduce herself to people who already knew who she was. But then she continued and the courtroom went absolutely silent. "And I need to tell you all something that I have never told anyone in this room. I was married to William Chen for 7 years, 3 decades ago, before he became the man who sits at that table. Before he became the man who destroyed every family he was supposed to protect." The room went silent. I heard someone in the gallery gasp. I heard a phone fall and clatter against the floor. And I looked at my father, and for the first time since the beginning of this entire nightmare, I saw something cross his face that looked like fear. Not surprise, not anger, but fear. The real, visceral, animal fear of someone who has just seen something they thought was buried forever claw its way back up to the surface. "Catherine," my father said, and his voice was different now, smaller, like a door had been opened that he had spent his entire life keeping locked. "Catherine, please." Judge Okonkwo, Catherine Okonkwo, the woman who had just removed her robe, the woman who had apparently been married to my father 30 years ago, looked at him with an expression that I can only describe as grief mixed with rage. The kind of expression that comes from years of feeling both of those things so intensely that they've fused into something new, something that doesn't have a name but that everyone in that room could feel. "You don't get to ask me to be quiet anymore, William. You lost that right a very long time ago." She turned to the courtroom, to the lawyers, to the gallery full of people who were witnessing something none of them had expected, and she said, "The evidence presented in this case has been reviewed extensively, but there is evidence that has not been presented, evidence that was deliberately hidden by the defendant's legal team, evidence that I discovered 2 weeks ago when I began my own investigation into this case after recognizing the plaintiff's name." This part still makes me pause when I think about it. She had known. From the moment she saw the case file, she had known who my father was. She had kept that information hidden, had kept herself impartial, had waited until the right moment to reveal what she knew, not for drama, for justice. Because she needed to make sure that what she was about to do was something that could not be dismissed as bias or prejudice or the vendetta of an ex-wife. She had waited because she knew that if she moved too soon, her personal connection to the case would be used to dismiss everything she had discovered. She had played the long game, the only game that could have worked, and she had won not through dramatic intervention but through patience and preparation, and the kind of quiet strength that the rest of us can only aspire to. "I have copies of financial records," she continued, her voice growing steadier now, more controlled, like she had found her footing in the storm. "Records dating back 15 years. These records show systematic embezzlement from the family company by William Chen. These records were not presented to this court because the defendant's legal team chose to focus on attacking the validity of the will rather than addressing the conduct of their own client. But I believe the court and the plaintiff deserve to know the truth about who William Chen really is." She walked to the edge of the bench, and she looked directly at me, and her eyes were wet, and she said, "Your grandfather was a good man, Marcus, the best man I ever knew, and he was right to trust you. He was right about everything. And I'm sorry that you had to stand in this room and listen to lies about who you are from someone who never deserved to call himself your father." I couldn't breathe, I couldn't move. I was watching a woman I had never met reveal that she had loved my grandfather, that she had married my father and escaped from him, that she had built a new life and become a judge and somehow ended up on the one case that would let her finally tell the truth about the man who had hurt her and hurt so many others. My grandfather had had another life that I knew nothing about, a chapter that he had never mentioned, a love story that had ended in the same kind of destruction that was now being replayed in this very courtroom. He had married my father before my father was my father, before he was the man who would raise me, and Catherine Okonkwo had been his wife. And something terrible had happened between them, and my grandfather had survived it, had built his company, had raised his family, had carried that wound silently for 30 years without ever telling his grandson about it. The twist I had not seen coming, the complication that changed everything, because I had walked into that courtroom thinking I was alone, thinking that everyone in the room saw me as the villain my father had painted me as, and instead I discovered that someone had been watching, had been waiting, had been gathering evidence to protect a grandson of a man she had loved 30 years before I was even born. My father's lawyer stood up and said something about procedural violations and the need for a mistrial, but Judge Okonkwo, still standing without her robe, said that the evidence she was presenting was not part of the case record and could not affect the verdict, but she wanted it entered into a separate investigation that she was now initiating as a private citizen who had personal knowledge of criminal conduct. The court was adjourned. My father's lawyer rushed him out of the room. And I sat there in the silence that followed, with my hands shaking and my vision blurred by tears that I couldn't stop, trying to process everything that had just happened. Elena reached over and took my hand, and she was crying too, and she said, "What just happened?" And I didn't have an answer for her. I still don't, not completely. What I know is that I walked into that courtroom expecting to lose everything, and I walked out with proof that my father had been stealing from the company for years, with evidence that he had lied under oath, with a judge who had once loved my grandfather and had finally gotten the chance to see justice done for the family that had been destroyed by the man who was supposed to protect them. In the weeks that followed, I learned pieces of the story. Catherine Okonkwo had found me through the company records, had traced my grandfather's legacy back through decades of corporate filings and personal documents. She had reached out to me in a letter, handwritten, formal, and in it she had explained that she had been married to my father in the early 1990s, that the marriage had lasted 7 years, and that she had left him because of what she described only as ongoing emotional and financial abuse. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. She had lived through something with my father that had been bad enough to make her leave, and she had rebuilt her entire life around the principles of justice and truth, and the belief that the people who hurt others should eventually be held accountable for what they have done. When she saw his name on the case file, she recognized it immediately, and she began her own investigation, gathering evidence outside of the official case, building a picture of who my father really was based on financial records and testimony, and the kind of methodical, patient work that she had spent her career perfecting in courtrooms just like the one where we had faced each other. The case was dismissed 3 weeks later. My father's lawyers abandoned him when they learned about the evidence Judge Okonkwo had uncovered. He was investigated by the State Attorney General's office for embezzlement and fraud, and the last I heard, he was facing multiple felony charges that would likely result in prison time. I didn't testify against him. I didn't need to. The evidence spoke for itself, and the people who had been paid to defend him realized that defending him was no longer possible. Patricia Harmon sent me a formal letter of apology, which I suppose was meant to make things right, though nothing about that whole experience could ever be made right. Some wounds just scar over. They don't heal. They just stop bleeding long enough for you to learn how to live around them. But here's what I think about now, all these months later, when I think about that day in court. I think about the moment my father called me a fraud, and I think about how that word felt like a physical blow, like something hitting my chest with enough force to crack bone. I think about how in that moment I believed him. Not because I thought he was telling the truth, but because the person who raised me had just told the world that I was capable of being the kind of person he knew I wasn't. And that kind of betrayal, the betrayal of someone who knows you well enough to destroy you completely, is something I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. It's the kind of wound that doesn't just hurt you in the moment, it changes you permanently, reconfigures the way you see yourself. The way you see other people, the way you trust. I used to believe that if someone knew me really well, they would like me. Now I'm not so sure. Now I know that knowing someone really well just means knowing exactly where to strike. I think about Judge Okonkwo taking off her robe, and I think about what it must have taken for her to wait that long, to keep herself impartial when every instinct must have been screaming at her to intervene the moment my father's name appeared on the case file. She waited because she needed to be sure. She waited because she knew that if she moved too soon, her personal connection to the case would be used to dismiss everything she had discovered. She played the long game, the only game that could have worked, and she won not through dramatic intervention but through patience and preparation, and the kind of quiet strength that the rest of us can only aspire to. I think about my grandfather. I think about how he knew my father would try to take everything, and how he documented the embezzlement, and how he left me everything not because he didn't love my father but because he finally understood that giving my father anything was the same as teaching him that his behavior was acceptable, that there were no consequences for betrayal, that family loyalty was just a weakness to be exploited. My grandfather didn't cut my father out of the will out of anger. He cut him out because he finally understood that love without boundaries is just permission to keep hurting you. He protected me the only way he knew how, through a legal document and a letter that said what he couldn't say out loud, which was that his own son had become someone he no longer recognized, someone who had already destroyed everything worth preserving in their family and was now coming back for whatever scraps remained. I think about Catherine Okonkwo sometimes. I think about how she must have known my grandfather as a young man before he built the company, before he became the stern and dignified figure I knew as a child. She must have known him when he was still the person he was before success changed him, before grief hardened him, before decades of disappointment carved out the parts of him that were soft and vulnerable. She must have known a version of my grandfather that I never got to see, and she had loved that version, and she had lost him too, just like I had. We were connected by the same loss, she and I, even though we had never met until that day in the courtroom. We were both people who had loved someone who had been taken away not by death, but by the slow, corrosive damage that one person can do to another, simply by choosing to be selfish over and over again, until there's nothing left but the shell. I run the company now. It's been hard, harder than I ever imagined, trying to undo 15 years of damage that my father did while I was growing up thinking everything was fine. There have been lawsuits from vendors he stiffed, employees who quit because they weren't paid, equipment that broke down because maintenance was deferred for years to hide where the money was actually going. The accounting was a nightmare. Months of reconstructing financial records, untangling a web of phantom accounts and forged invoices and payments that went nowhere. I hired a forensic accountant who spent 4 months going through every transaction since my grandfather's illness, and when she finally showed me the total, I sat in my office and stared at the number for a long time. It was more than I had imagined, more than I wanted to know, a sum that represented years of systematic theft that had hollowed out the company from the inside while everyone assumed it was thriving. But we're getting there. Slowly but surely, we're getting there. I hired back the employees who had quit. I renegotiated terms with vendors. I replaced the equipment that had been neglected. I brought in new leadership, people who believed in what we were building, and who understood that sustainability was more important than speed. Elena and I are better now than we were before. The crisis did something to us that I didn't expect. It stripped away the comfortable distance we had grown into over the years and forced us to decide whether we were willing to rebuild together. We went to therapy, both of us individually and then together, and we talked about things we had never talked about before, things we had been afraid to talk about because talking about them meant admitting they existed. I told her about the fear, the constant low-grade terror that I was going to fail, that I was going to prove everyone right about me. She told me about her own fear, the fear of being married to someone who was slowly disappearing into his own head, who was shutting her out even as he was drowning. We learned how to listen to each other again, really listen, not just wait for our turn to speak. And we emerged from it stronger, not because the crisis was good or us, but because we chose to face it together instead of letting it pull us apart. As for my father, I haven't seen him since the day he walked out of that courtroom. I've heard things. Lawyers' letters mostly, and a few messages from relatives who think I should find it in my heart to reconcile with him. I don't respond to those messages. I don't know if he ever thinks about what he did. I don't know if he understands that he didn't just try to take a company from me. He tried to take my identity, my sense of self, my ability to trust anyone who says they love me. I don't know if he lies awake at night like I did, replaying the moments that broke everything, or if he has found some way to convince himself that he was justified in what he did, that I deserved it somehow, that he was just trying to reclaim what was rightfully his. Maybe someday I'll be ready to see him again. Maybe someday I'll understand why people become the kind of people who would destroy their own children for money. But I'm not there yet, and I'm not sure I ever will be, and maybe that's okay. Maybe sometimes understanding isn't the point. Maybe sometimes the only thing you need to understand is that you don't have to understand, that you can simply choose to move forward without answers and still be whole. What I do know is this: I thought I was protecting my grandfather's legacy, but I was only learning how to be strong enough to survive what it costs to love someone who doesn't love you back. That's when I understood something that took me 34 years to learn. The people who raise us are not always the people who deserve to be called family. Sometimes family is the judge who takes off her robe in the middle of a courtroom to tell the truth that everyone else was afraid to speak. Sometimes family is the grandfather who spends his life building something so that his grandson will have a future worth fighting for. Sometimes family is not about blood at all. It's about the people who show up when it matters most, who tell the truth even when it costs them everything, who see you clearly and choose to stay anyway. And sometimes family is just you, standing alone in the wreckage of everything you thought you knew, deciding that you're strong enough to rebuild it alone if you have to. Because you always were, you just needed the right moment to discover it. And when that moment comes, when you find yourself in a courtroom with your hands shaking and your vision blurred and the person you trusted most in the world telling the world you're nothing, you find out who you are, not the person you were raised to be. Not the person your family wanted you to be, just the person you are when everything else is stripped away. And that person, that raw and real and unfiltered version of yourself, is enough. It has always been enough. You just had to go through the fire to realize it.